And welcome to this year's special Center for Political Communication National Agenda event. So we've put together, I think, what will be a very fascinating and informative program about the state of Delaware and where it fits into the nation in terms of politics and human development. And so I'm Paul Brewer. I'm acting director of the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication. I'm filling in for Ralph Begliter, who is on sabbatical this year. He'll be back next year. And the only way I can tell that he's on sabbatical this year is he's working about 50 or 60 hours a week instead of 70 or 80. So he does a lot of great work for the center. And our other speakers today, David Wilson, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations here at the University of Delaware, and Michael Dimock of the Pew Research Center for the People in the Press, of which he is the director, and Sarah Burd-Sharps, who is the co-director of Measure of America of the Social Science Research Council. And so we're each going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes and then leave the remaining time for question and answer with you. So let's get started. And first I should mention that this program was made possible by the generous support of the William P. Frank Foundation. And this event is one of a series of events that this gift is going to help make happen. In the fall of 2014, the National Agenda is going to come back with a full slate of weekly events leading up to the 2014 midterm elections, the centerpiece of which will be the 2014 edition of the Delaware debates, focusing on the congressional and Senate campaigns that are up for re-election that year. And I should also mention that next week, same place, same time, there will be a free screening of the documentary Terms and Conditions May Apply, which is a very critically acclaimed and perhaps disturbing documentary about what corporations in the government can learn about you through the internet when you agree to click on that you agree to the terms and conditions. Now, tonight, we're going to be talking about Delaware and the nation. So, as we like to talk about here, Delaware is at the epicenter of American politics today. So, the Vice President, Joe Biden, is from Delaware and a UD alum. Prominent campaign managers like David Plouffe and Steve Schmidt from Delaware went to the University of Delaware. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie also has a Delaware connection, a graduate of the University of Delaware. But despite all this, there's not a lot of research or polling that focuses directly on the state of Delaware and what Delawareans think about politics and how they fit into the national political scene. And so for tonight, David and I are going to talk about the results of a new poll of the Delaware public that we conducted to try to figure out what Delawareans think about key political issues and key political figures. And so that's what I'll be talking about now, and then David will pick up and talk about some of the other results. Just a little bit about the poll. So this is a telephone survey of 902 Delawareans done by probability sampling, so these results are representative of the Delaware public as a whole, with a margin of error of about 4%. And we did this in early September, so keep that in mind when interpreting some of the results that I'm going to be talking about. So the first question on the survey, and the first set of results I'm going to talk about, focused on how much are Delawareans actually paying attention to what's going on in national politics and what's going on in Delaware politics. So we asked a couple questions. How closely do you follow news about political events in Washington and in Delaware? So first, the results for following news about Washington. So 2/3 of the people that we polled said that they were paying very or somewhat close attention to what was going on in Washington. Now, 1/3 weren't paying that much attention, so a fair number of Delawareans are paying attention, but certainly not all. When we asked about Delaware, the number was slightly lower. Still 60%, still a majority saying that they follow Delaware politics very or somewhat closely, but there is a bit of a drop-off from the national results. The next thing we asked about was how do Delawareans follow politics? And so we asked, how do you get most of your news about political events and figures in Delaware? And so here are the results. So television is in the lead at 45%, followed by internet, 30%, newspapers 28%, and then far behind interpersonal communication and radio. Now, when I was looking at the results, I will admit this is one of the results that made me scratch my head a little bit. Because unless, I'm fairly new to the state, but unless I've been missing something in the last 2.5 years, there aren't any phantom local Delaware TV news stations out there. So keep in mind that television is what Delawareans say is the #1 source of news about Delaware politics, and what impact that might have on how much and what they know about what's actually going on in their state. The next thing we asked about is what issues are at the top of the Delaware public's agenda. And here's what we found. We asked, what do you think is the most important problem facing Delaware today? And easily the leader was jobs and unemployment, 29%. And if you add into the 10% who said the economy, it's an even more lopsided margin. So what Delawareans are primarily concerned about, even 5 years after the great financial meltdown in 2008, jobs and the economy are still at the top of the Delaware public's agenda. Now, education was second at 12%. Government overreach down at 7%. If you're wondering where healthcare is, it didn't even get up to 5%. It was about 3%. So there's a lot of talk about healthcare this last month in national politics, but it was not an issue that Delawareans mentioned when we asked what's the most important problem facing the state. Another thing, besides looking at how much and how people are paying attention to Delaware national politics, we wanted to find out what Delawareans think of some key national and state political figures. Now, as you'll see, we tried to cover a lot of topics in this survey, which meant that we had to pick and choose who and what we asked about. So polling is very expensive. There are only so many things we could do in this study. We're hoping, if resources to permit, to do a series of polls like this. But bear in mind, we could only ask questions about a few people and a few issues. So certainly there are lots of other topics that would be useful to explore in future polls. But we asked about 3 national Democratic politicians and 3 national Republican politicians to gauge what Delawareans thought of these folks. First, let's take the national Democrats. So we asked how favorable or unfavorably Delawareans viewed Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton. So for Barack Obama, Delawareans, this shouldn't come as a huge shock. You know, Barack Obama carried Delaware in 2008 and 2012 without too much trouble. And so Delawareans, by an almost 2-to-1 margin, have favorable views of Obama. We asked about Joe Biden. 65% of Delawareans saw their home state vice president favorably, only 28% unfavorably. And for Hillary Clinton, the vice president might say, if he were here, that his numbers and Hillary Clinton's numbers are literally tied. 65% favorable for both of them, 28% unfavorable, 7% never heard of or can't rate. Now, it might surprise and disturb some of you that 7% of the public had never heard of or couldn't rate Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, but there is a core of members of the public who don't really follow politics all that much, and it's always important to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of national Republicans, the results for the Democrats were all pretty much the same. Here's where things get a little more interesting. So Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey, UD alum, up for re-election next week. Barring a major political shock, he'll probably be re-elected. Delawareans viewed him pretty favorably, 56% favorable, only 24% unfavorable. 1/5 said that they couldn't rate him or never heard of him. Now let's compare him to Paul Ryan, who, bear in mind, was the Republican vice presidential nominee a year ago in 2012. So 31% to 30% favorable and unfavorable, and almost twice as many had never heard of him or couldn't rate him as Chris Christie. And then Marco Rubio, whose name has been mentioned a lot in national coverage over the last year as the potential great hope of the Republican Party for 2016. And over half of Delawareans had never heard of him or couldn't rate him. So Chris Christie does considerably better than either Paul Ryan or Marco Rubio with the Delaware public, looking at our results. Let's turn from national politicians to Delaware politicians. So here we asked about a few more politicians, starting with the Delaware delegation to Congress. So Senators Tom Carper and Chris Coons. Carper was re-elected last year. Coons is up for re-election next year. And U.S. Representative John Carney also up for re-election next year. First, let's look at Carper. 61% favorable, 19% unfavorable, 20% never heard of or can't write. So 3 to 1 positive. Chris Coons is still 2 to 1 positive, but his favorability ratings aren't as high, and there are more Delawareans who couldn't rate him or had never heard of him. And John Carney's numbers look very much like Chris Coons. 2 to 1 favorable, but less familiar with the public than Tom Carper. Now, we asked about 3 state officials: Governor Jack Markell, State Attorney General Beau Biden, and State Treasurer Chip Flowers. Jack Markell's numbers look a lot like Tom Carper's. 3 to 1 favorable, and 20% never heard of him or can't write. Beau Biden's numbers look very much like Markell's and Carper's. So very favorable rating for Beau Biden there. Chip Flowers, elected state treasurer recently, 28% favorable to 12% unfavorable. So people who've heard of Chip Flowers back when we did the poll had a favorable opinion of him by and large. But well over half the public had never heard of him or couldn't rate him. We also asked about Christine O'Donnell and the Tea Party. And here we see, this is the first case where we've seen someone whose unfavorables are higher than their favorables. So 30 to 43%, more Delawareans seeing O'Donnell unfavorably than favorably. And if you look at Delawareans' ratings at the Tea Party, very close to their ratings of O'Donnell. So Delawareans, on the whole, not so keen about O'Donnell or the Tea Party, but for both, there's a core of about a third of Delawareans who are favorable towards O'Donnell and are favorable toward the Tea Party. Now, Mike Dimock of the Pew Research Center may be talking a little bit about what's been happening with national public opinion about the Tea Party, but that's his thunder, so I'll let him talk about that if he wants to. Now, we've already brought up Coons and O'Donnell. We also asked a head-to-head question. If the 2014 Senate election were held today and the candidates were...
You went back.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, David. And the candidates were Coons and O'Donnell, who would you vote for? And so Coons got 51%, O'Donnell 28%. Neither other 14%, 8% don't know or refused. So that's a 23-point lead for Coons, and he's above the 50% mark. So as of right now, the landscape is much more favorable to Coons and O'Donnell if that is actually the rematch in 2014. We also looked at results by county. Now, bear in mind when looking at these that the populations for these counties are pretty different. Newcastle has many more people than Kent or Sussex County. It's also a place where Coons has a pretty big lead over O'Donnell. In Kent and Sussex, it's closer, but there are fewer people there. And even in, as we'll see in a second, Sussex County, which is the strongest county for the Republican Party in Delaware, O'Donnell is still behind Coons. Which brings up the question, is Delaware a blue, a purple, or a red state? In other words, is it a Democratic stronghold, a Republican stronghold, or is it a real battleground? We asked Delawareans, in politics today, do you consider yourself a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent? And the first thing that jumps out here is the Democrats outnumber the Republicans by almost a 2 to 1 margin. So that gives any Democratic candidate in Delaware a big cushion to start off with. There are a fair number of independents, about a third of the public. If you break it down by county, you see that that pattern holds in Newcastle County. Kent's kind of in the middle. And then Sussex County is the one county where the Republican Party may have an edge. Finally, before I turn things over to David, we asked Delawareans what they thought about the federal government. So there's been a lot of talk about this in the news the past month. We did this poll before the government shut down. So interpret these results in light of the timing of the study. We asked a question which the Pew Research Center also asks a lot, and Mike may talk about this some. We asked, how much of the time can you trust the government in Washington to do what is right? Let's start with the percentage that said just about always. 3%. Most of the time. 20% more. There's still a lot of the public unaccounted for. Only some of the time, 65%. And then another 12%, even though it wasn't an option offered in the question, said never. So that's where things stand. Now, the final thing that I'll point out here is notice the contrast between what Delawareans think of the government in Washington and what they think of many of their own state politicians, including the Delaware congressional delegation. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to David Wilson, my colleague in the Department of Political Science and International Relations.
Thanks, Paul. All right. So I'm going to talk about some of the hot button political issues. And these are hot button issues on the national level, but we wanted to know what Delawareans thought about them at the state level. So the issues we'll talk about include government surveillance of internet and email. What do you think about the government watching what you're doing when you're online, checking your email, surfing the web? Same-sex marriage, hot button issue. Felon voting rights, the ability of people who have been arrested, served their times, and now are back out. Do they have the right to vote? Should they have the right to vote? And I'll talk more about those when we get the data. And voter ID laws. More specifically, the need for a photo ID to actually vote when you go to the polls on Election Day. So before I talk to you about the results of those, I want to tell you how we studied these things. And those of us who study political communication, we look for informational effects. We're interested in the extent to which additional bits and pieces of information actually affect how you think about politics and how you subsequently behave. So we do that through experiments, and I just want to give you an example so you know how we're going about studying this stuff. I could ask you, how much do you like the UD mascot? You all know UD, right? The mascot, UD. And I don't have to give you any picture, I just ask you the question. That's usually what happens in your telephone surveys. You're sitting on the phone with somebody and they just ask you a question, and you just got what's at the top of your head. I could also ask a different version of the question and ask you what you think of UD's mascot and compare a colored image, just a black and white image, to one with no image. Now, if the image doesn't matter, the responses to the question should be exactly the same. But if the image does matter, that's what we call an informational effect. And there are all kinds of information we could add on to any question. We could just do blue and white colors, or we can do blue and gold colors. The key is that we can actually compare one color to nothing. And since we do what's called a randomized survey experiment, we can tell that definitely any difference in response is due exactly to that thing that we randomized, that information. So as you look at some of the results, we'll think about and talk about how the information matters. So our first issue is about e-surveillance, right? What do you think about the US government being able to monitor your online and email activities? And so this is what we call the baseline question. The responses to that are your baseline opinions. But we can also ask this in another condition, another version of the question, which we randomized to another third of the sample. We could say, well, hey, here's a good reason. Do you think the government should be able to monitor online and email activities to help prevent future terrorist attacks? The only thing that's different between those two questions is just this piece of information. So if the information doesn't matter, the responses to the question should be the same, right? But what if we not only gave a good reason, but we gave some additional information? Yeah, do you think it's okay for the US government to look at what you're doing online to help prevent terrorist attacks, even if it intrudes on your personal privacy? So you can see the difference between the baseline opinion, this bit of information, plus a little bit more, right? And if the information doesn't matter, responses should be the same, right? All right, so what do we get? 18% say yes, the US government should be able to monitor your online activities. When we offer a good reason, that number goes up to 38. That's a 20 percentage point increase. Just by adding in that little bit of information, people say, yes, I'm more willing to say that the government should be able to monitor online activities. That's what we call an informational effect, right? When we say good reason, but, the number goes down about 5 percentage points from the previous one, but it's still up about 15 percentage points from the baseline opinion. That's what we study in political communication, the extent to which messaging matters. That's why we have political consultants. That's why we have advertising, because we know information matters and we know public opinions are very movable. And the way to study them is by randomizing that information to see if it actually changes your opinion. So on this issue, we see that the public is not, well, Delawareans are not very supportive of the government being able to monitor your online activities, but we can change your opinion by offering you some information that may justify your opinion. If you're principled, you don't change your opinion. But if politics matters, you do change your opinion, right? Politics matters, right? All right, so another question on same-sex marriage. In this case, the baseline opinion was very straightforward. Do you basically favor or oppose allowing gays and lesbians to legally marry? We gave that to a random half of the respondents, and then we gave another random half another bit of information that said, hey, look, I'm going to give you a way that you can justify whatever your opinion is. I'm going to tell you what Delaware did. As you may know, Delaware recently passed a law allowing gays and lesbians to legally marry. What's your opinion on same-sex marriage? Same two questions, we only randomized a little bit of information about Delaware. When we look at the results, we find that information doesn't matter. There's no informational effect. Delawareans are pretty principled on their stance about same-sex marriage. Right? Now, we could have added other bits of information. We could have put more negative information, more positive. But the one thing we see is that if this is consistent, then at least saying that Delaware did something didn't change people's information on it. They're supportive of what Delaware did. So if you're a politician and you supported that constitutional amendment, you're in good shape. All right? Just an FYI. Right? All right. So Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage. Aside from just supporting the issue, do you support the federal government actually allowing same-sex married couples to actually get benefits? Again, 67% to 33%. Even when we ask about what the Supreme Court is doing, Delawareans support their stance on same-sex marriage. Right? So if you have one stance that's in opposition to Delawareans, this gives you a sense of where the state is going politically, or where the state is politically. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, wait a minute, those are those liberals in Newcastle County, or those conservatives in Sussex County, or some mix in between there that's actually influencing this, because it doesn't look the same. That this idea is not consistent. So we needed to figure out why. And so we looked at two different things. One of them was about contact. And so if you don't know a person who is gay or lesbian, 46% of those persons actually favor or strongly favor same-sex marriage. But what if you actually do know someone who's gay or lesbian? It's up to 56%. That's a 10 percentage point increase. Well, what if you have a close family member or a friend who's gay or lesbian? 64%. What if you know a married couple, a gay or lesbian married couple? 77%. So this tells us something about how contact or familiarity actually matters. All right, so individuals may have some fear about what this may do to society or what this may do to norms and culture. But as you know more people, as you have more contact, you see that support for same-sex marriage actually goes up, right? So now let's answer the ideology question. Here are conservatives. As conservatives get to know more people who are gay or lesbian, they actually come to support same-sex marriage more. So if you don't know anyone, if you're a conservative and you don't know anyone who's gay or lesbian, 26% support same-sex marriage. If you know someone, it's up to 42%. If you have a close family member or friend, and I apologize for the cutoff there, it's up to 48%. And if you know a married or gay and lesbian couple, 55%. That's a 29 percentage point increase, right, in support. That's effective. More contact, more familiarity, more support. Moderates, exact same pattern. Even liberals, exact same pattern. While 69% of liberals who don't know someone who is gay or lesbian support same-sex marriage, as they know more people or have closer contact, they actually too increase their support for same-sex marriage. Right? So contact matters. It matters importantly in the state of Delaware. Okay, what about felon voting rights? You know, not every state allows people who've been convicted of a felony to vote. Some allow felons who are in jail to vote. Some allow felons who are released from jail to vote. But what about the state of Delaware? And what does the public think about this issue in Delaware? So we asked people, would you strongly approve or disapprove of a law allowing felons convicted of nonviolent crimes to vote after they are released from jail? So we tried to match the wording to the actual law itself. The responses to this question formed our baseline opinions. No context, no information other than just the question. But we asked another version of the question, another group got, well, some people argue that felons should have the right to vote when they have paid their debt to society. We offered that information, and then we asked the question. Right? So we gave people some information, an argument, and then let them make their decision. But we had to give a counterbalanced argument that said, hey, look, it's too bad, you know. Some people argue that felons sacrifice their right to vote when they break the law. What do you think? What's your opinion about it? So we offer that second argument, then we ask them their opinion. And then finally, we did the Delaware standard here, where Delaware stands on the issue. We said the Delaware legislature recently passed an amendment to the state constitution that allows felons convicted of a nonviolent crime to vote after they're released from jail. What's your opinion on it? So we give people some information and we let them offer their opinion. So what we see? Baseline opinion, overwhelming majority. When these numbers get up to almost 75% or so, we call it a consensus. So there's a strong consensus that, hey, felons should be allowed to vote if they're released from jail and their felony was a nonviolent crime, right? When we offer the argument pay debt to society, that number doesn't change at all. It's almost as if, okay, yeah, that's my rationalization for supporting it in the first place, right? But when we say, hey, lost your right to vote when you broke the law, the number goes down about 6 percentage points, but that's not outside what we call the margin of error. Those numbers, the 72% and the 66%, are not that different, right? And finally, if we give people an out or an in to justify things in terms of Delaware having passed an amendment, 66% as well. Not much change. There's a strong consensus that Delawareans support allowing felons who've been convicted of nonviolent crimes to vote once they're released from jail. Right? What about voter ID laws? Having to show a photo ID when you go to the polls to vote. Let me do a quick internal poll here. Does Delaware require you to show a photo ID to vote? Raise your hand if you say yes. Raise them high. You can't count, yeah. Raise your hand if it's no. You guys looked at the test last night, I think. I don't know what's going on. 70% of people, this room, it's not what Delaware looks like. 70% of people said, yes, Delaware requires me to show a photo ID when I go to vote. 7 out of 10 people say they have to show a photo ID to vote. People ask?
They instruct poll workers to ask.
We can talk about that during Q&A. We can actually talk about that during Q&A. But one thing's for sure, you don't have to show a photo ID to vote in Delaware, but 70% of people think they do. And this is actually in line with the national average. We actually find that people who say that they have to show a photo ID are more likely to not actually have to do it when we look at the actual state numbers. Paul and I have actually done some research on this. Pretty interesting stuff. So again, 23% say, no, I don't. Those are the people who are correct, right? 7% say they don't know. So in reality, 77% of people are wrong, and only 23% are actually correct. That's about information. That's about how the issue can be confused if you get enough bits and pieces of things in the media mix, in the information mix. So something to consider as we look at the results for the next question. Do you strongly favor or oppose these voter ID laws, right? Mostly favor, mostly oppose, or strongly oppose. This is the baseline question. But one thing that Paul and I have actually discovered in our research is that if you tell people that these laws might actually harm some individuals, eligible voters or other groups, such as seniors or African Americans, that may actually have an effect on their opinion on the law. Nobody wants to harm someone who is eligible to vote. So one of the frames we asked, or we offered, was, hey, opponents of voter ID laws argue they will prevent people who are eligible to vote from voting. They will almost disenfranchise them, right? And then we asked them their opinion. Or we can offer that same argument, but add on to the end of it, these laws will affect elderly voters particularly hard. Or offer the same hurts eligible voters and offer at the end, and these laws will affect African American voters particularly hard. Right? Those 4 pieces of information might have an effect. Baseline opinion, 82%. 82% of Delawareans favor, mostly or strongly, voter ID laws. Remember, 70% think you already have to show them. 82% favor voter ID laws. When we argue that they might actually harm individuals, such as eligible voters, that number goes down by about 9 percentage points. If we say it'll affect elderly voters particularly hard, it goes down about 14 percentage points, and will affect African American voters particularly hard. That number goes down about 19 percentage points. So if we tell people that these laws actually might harm people, that informational effect actually works. Now, 63% is still a majority. It's a strong majority. It's over a majority, right? But that number actually goes down. You can actually change opinion by offering information about groups. All right, finally, are there any racial differences in these opinions? The important thing to look for in this chart is the gap here between whites and racial minorities. When we ask this question, we compare the racial gap here, there's about a 14 percentage point gap between whites. Whites are much more likely to support voter ID laws than racial minorities. But this number, 72% of racial minorities actually supporting voter ID laws, that's not rare. We find the same information, the same levels at the national average. If we compare racial groups under the Prevent Eligible Voters from Voting, notice how the gap gets larger, right? And then we compare will affect elderly voters particularly hard, that gap gets smaller. And then if we look at will affect African American voters particularly hard, look how the number, 38%, is almost half from the baseline condition. So when you ask racial minorities, do they support voter ID laws with no information, 72% support it. When you say that, hey, it may affect African American voters particularly hard, racial minorities, and this is not just African Americans, this is all racial minorities, that support for voter ID laws goes down to 38%. Self-interest matter. People think about the effects on themselves. But this question about the elderly is about age. So we also wanted to look at how age may play into this. And so we compared persons who are not elderly, 50 plus are not elderly persons, they're seniors. So we're calling them seniors. We compared the question, we had to ask because it's about age. So we compared baseline between those who are 50 or older and less than 50, strong support, 8 in 10 support voter ID laws. If we say, well, hey, some people may be adversely affected, they respond to that information. They're less likely to support, but there is no age gap, right? We saw a racial gap. We didn't see an age gap. If we say elderly voters will be affected particularly hard, those who are less than 50 are slightly more likely to favor, but these numbers are not statistically different. In other words, there is no age effect. There is no age gap, right? So this argument doesn't work on age, right? But the racial argument did work on race. Again, no gap here. So the numbers are lower under these informational conditions, but there is no age gap. Right? All right, so our conclusion is that Delaware is still a blue state. I mean, we respond with strong support for same-sex marriage, felon voting, and electronic surveillance, but we see that these opinions are malleable. They move quite a bit. We see also that race matters in terms of voter ID laws, and these informational effects show themselves under the e-surveillance types of questions. Right?
Michael Dimock, who's the director of the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press. And for those of you unfamiliar with the Pew Research Center, their polling operation is really the gold standard for nonpartisan polling on news and political events in the country. And so they have a great website, which is pewresearch.org. And I strongly encourage you, if you're interested at all in what the public thinks about politics and news, to visit there. They have a wealth of information. Just on a personal note, I'll mention that Mike and his wife also hosted my wedding reception. So, a couple years ago. Yes, it was a little while ago.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me. Let me pivot to a national scene, since that's my focus. At the Pew Research Center, we do a lot of polling about events and issues and breaking news stories, but we're also trying to put them in a broader perspective. So let me try to take a few moments here to talk about the most recent major domestic news story, the shutdown and debt ceiling debate, what we're seeing in the polling about how the public reacted to that scenario during and after those events, and how that fits into the broader issue in American politics of political polarization and gridlock, which was clearly the frustration in Congress during that debate. How much are the roots of that in the American public, or is that a function of Congress and the institutions that's not really a reflection of American society more broadly? There's no doubt that the shutdown and debt ceiling was a pretty low moment for most Americans. People followed it very closely. In a question similar to what was asked here in Delaware, 49% said they followed very closely what was going on in the final days of a deal being struck. Another 30% said they were following somewhat closely. That's clearly going to be one of the biggest stories of the year, one of the bigger stories of the last few years from the American public's level of attention. And what changed is the American public's levels of frustration. And I'll give you one example, a question that we asked just last weekend after the deal had been struck and sort of, okay, we've gotten through this. And we said, well, just in your own words, what one word, if you had to use just one word to describe your reaction to the government shutdown and the debt ceiling debate, what word comes to mind? So you can think about your own word. Maybe don't say it out loud if it's rude. Because we got a lot of bad words, let's just say. Ridiculous, stupid, disgusting, frustrating, childish, a joke. That was the general theme, and I think it captures what the American public's feelings were. A feeling of frustration, I think, is the best view of it all. And you see that affecting some of the core evaluations that we look at, kind of indicators of the American public's mood and feelings about government. Views of Congress are hovering at all-time lows. You see job approval ratings or favorability ratings. The impression that Congress has become completely dysfunctional has become virtually universal in this period. Trust in government, Paul talked about a question asked here before the shutdown. Trust in government fell again to new lows after this debate. 19% in our survey saying they always or most of the time trust government. The vast majority saying only some of the time, or volunteering, as you found here, never. That's one of my favorite polling questions. Just as an aside, the reason we ask it that way is that question was invented in 1958. And they thought they would come up with a really good scale of American feelings about government, so they picked those categories. How often do you trust the government to do what's right? Just about always, most of the time, or only some of the time. Didn't really cross their mind to add a never category, but that's a very, very popular category today. And another question we ask, how do you feel about the federal government and the way it's operating? Angry, frustrated, but not angry, or are you content? We're finding now 30% saying they feel angry about what's going on in Washington. You may have thought it would be higher, but that's the highest we've ever measured on a measure like that. So there are a lot of indicators that we're really at a moment of public frustration here. But you don't want to read too much into that in terms of how broadly that anger or frustration reaches. One thing is, our polling suggests that it's very, very focused on elected officials, Congress and Obama. It doesn't really stretch to the government in general. In fact, in the poll we finished just in the final days, or right after this was during the shutdown. I'm sorry, I'm getting myself confused. We asked people, well, what do you think about some of the other parts of government? How do you feel about government employees? Well, 62% offer a favorable impression of government employees. How about some of the agencies? I mean, Health and Human Services is in the news, 61% have a favorable impression. The Federal Reserve, 57% favorable. The NSA, a contentious institution, 54% favorable opinion. The lowest agency we had was the IRS that we asked people to rank, and that was still 44% favorable, 51% unfavorable. That's hardly, a lot of hatred or anger expressed from the public there. So I just want to emphasize that most of this is really focused on the elected officials in Washington. It's not a broad brush that government, in general, is fundamentally failing. Another, even more to the point, is people are blaming the individuals, not the system. And what I mean by that is there's an argument among a lot of people who want to reform politics about how do we change the rules in a way that maybe will fix this? Can we get rid of the filibuster or something like that? From the public's perspective, this is not a systemic problem, it's a personnel problem. Most Americans say if we could just get these people out and replace them with new people, it would all work again. Now that may or may not be the case. I think a lot of political scientists would argue otherwise, but the general perception from the public is that this is really more about the people in Washington. They say 58% tell us in this poll we just did, the system can work fine, it's the members that are the problem. Only 32% say that the members have good intention, it's the system itself that's broken. Now, all of this combines to a measure of probably the core measure going into 2014 is we've seen a record high anti-incumbent sentiment. Not only are 74% saying that they want most members of Congress to be defeated next year, it's very easy to say defeat the other guy, but we found 38% saying that they want their own member of Congress to be defeated. Now, that's not a majority, but that's very high, because typically, and as seen in the poll you guys did in Delaware, people tend to like their members. They don't tend to like the rest of the members of Congress. To get 38% saying they want their own member out, and that actually crossed party lines, is a pretty high number, and it indicates the level of frustration people have right now. Now, a lot of that frustration gets to the issue, is focused on this issue of compromise, the sense that the political actors in Washington are just dug in and they won't work together, they won't come to compromise. And compromise, kind of picking up on some of what David was talking about, is one of the most interesting concepts to try to test in public opinion polling, because the language you use really matters. Compromise, everybody loves compromise. Well, not everybody, it turns out. Let me qualify that slightly. But most people like the idea of compromise. Most people want members to work together to try to find a solution. There was a poll that CBS and the New York Times put out in the early stages of the shutdown, and they said, well, do you think that Barack Obama should compromise with Republicans to come some kind of an agreement? And 76% said, well, yeah, of course. And then they said, well, do you think Republicans should compromise with Barack Obama to try to come up with some sort of agreement? 78%, yeah, they should try to compromise. And we thought, well, okay, but what they were talking about was, is health insurance going to be part of the deal or not? I mean, there wasn't a lot of compromise, and that's what they were saying. So we said, well, we did a survey the next weekend and sort of pushed people right up to that edge a little bit more. We said, well, you know, do you think Obama should compromise, or do you think Republicans should compromise? Well, the Republicans said Obama should, the Democrats said the Republicans should. Okay, fine, that's easy. But then we said, well, if you think the Republicans should compromise, we said, well, do you think it would be acceptable for Obama to give ground on this if it's the only way to end this shutdown, or should he stick to his guns no matter what? And a majority of Democrats said, stick to his guns, don't back down. And you ask the Republicans the same question, well, should the Republicans be willing to back down if it's the only way to end this, or should they stick to their guns? A majority of Republicans said stick to their guns. The thing about compromise is it depends on the circumstances, and people like it in the abstract. They like the idea of working together. But when you get down to issues people care about, their willingness to compromise evaporates very quickly. You see it on issues like abortion. You see it on a lot of issues that people feel very deeply about. The principle of compromise matters, and in practice it's a different question. And I think that, you know, to some extent, many partisans on both sides of this issue in the general public really kind of got riled up about this issue at the time it was going on, and really felt that their side was in the right and shouldn't have to give up on what they were standing up for. Let me just speak briefly about political winners and losers. That's what people always want to know after an event like this. And I think there's a general narrative that the Republicans really lost a lot of ground in this. And I would just offer a more cautious take on that, particularly if you're a Democrat thinking that this is going to be really great. I think, to be sure, the Republicans took most of the blame for this. That's not unusual. Usually the congressional institution it's easier to blame a big group of people who don't speak with one voice than it is a singular individual. And the congressional, in a battle between a president and a Congress of the other party, it's not unusual for the congressional party to come out on the losing side in the blame game. And you see a lot of measures of the Republican Party's image suffering as a result of this. But on a lot of the fundamental questions, they haven't actually lost that much ground. When you shift from just saying, well, do you have a positive or negative image of the Republican Party, or favorable or unfavorable, the Republican Party may have lost some ground. But when you say, go to what we think of as a head-to-head question, well, who do you think would do a better job on the economy, Republicans or Democrats? Who do you think would do a better job on immigration? They didn't really lose any ground. A lot of the Republican Party's standing in the public's eye has held steady. We had, in the poll we did right in the late stages, 44% saying they thought the Republican Party would do a better job on the economy, 37% the Democratic Party. That was unchanged from a poll we had done earlier in the summer. The same with immigration, the same with managing the government. And critically, the 2014 vote, next year, would you like to see a Republican or a Democrat elected in your district? The Democrats held a 6-point edge in this national poll, 49 to 43. That's an edge, but at this point in 2009, before the 2010 election, they held a 6-point edge. And in 2010, the Republicans picked up a lot of seats. That's not a particularly powerful edge for the Democrats coming out of this. And the differential there is that the Republican Party's image is a lot worse than the Democratic Party's, but a lot of that difference is from Republicans who are critical of their own party, not because independents feel differently about the Republican Party. In other words, independents hate both parties right now. They think both of them are acting foolishly. They think neither party is really representing their views particularly well. The Republican Party's overall ratings are lower because Republicans themselves don't even like how their own party's behaving, mostly because they think they think it's compromising too much, and they think it's not being conservative enough, you know. So you have to keep in mind that the Republican Party lags partly because of self-criticism and internal divisions, yet when you get to an election cycle, that doesn't necessarily have the same broad implications in terms of who can win. I've hinted at it, but let me mention briefly the Tea Party. I think one group whose image clearly was harmed over the course of the shutdown and the debt ceiling debate was the Tea Party. Now that's a loose concept. There's no formal membership. It's an idea that many Americans aren't familiar with, as Paul says. You know, not everybody's a political junkie thinking about these different actors. But by almost every measure, the image of the Tea Party was worsened over the course of this. We had the lowest favorable rating of the Tea Party in its image. Fewer people saying they agree with the Tea Party, more saying they disagree with the Tea Party. There's a sense that the public, many more people had heard of the Tea Party by the end of this than before this shutdown. But again, there's a caveat, which is that the intensity of the folks who do agree with the Tea Party was not diminished at all. In fact, by some measures, you could say that the people who are Tea Party believers or activists or agreeers, however you want to define it, feel at least as intensely about their views and positions as they did before this shutdown. The frustration and anger that drives a lot of folks who have conservative views and their sense of the leadership of the country right now has not abated at all. Their conservative priorities about reducing spending and the deficit have not shifted in any fundamental way. And I think one of the things that really distinguishes the Tea Party is not only ideology and outlook and anger, but a different approach to politics. I mean, one of the sentiments that really distinguishes Tea Party and non-Tea Party Republican identifiers is an unwillingness to compromise. And that doesn't mean that they see that as a positive. I mean, they're the group for whom the word compromise is a negative. It means giving up on your principles. And giving up on your principles is unacceptable to most folks who identify with the Tea Party right now. One of the notable elements of it is Ted Cruz, a figure who wasn't, you know, was sort of floating around before this, but certainly got a big boost in attention over the course of the shutdown debate. In every other segment of the public, his unfavorables went up. Among Tea Party Republicans, his favorability rating went from 47 before the shutdown to 74 after the shutdown. You know, that intensity and level of support is very clear. Now, you would think from that maybe the American public really has become more polarized to get to this broader theme. I mean, we've seen a Congress which by almost every measure has Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate farther and farther from each other, talking to each other less ideological overlap, more party line voting, less willingness to come to any kinds of agreements. Is that characteristic in the American public more broadly? And a corollary to that is an argument that many have made in Washington, and particularly very smart people in Washington, that this polarization is what they call asymmetrical, meaning it's not that both sides have moved apart, it's that one side has moved apart, that the Republican Party has fundamentally changed over this time period, and that's the cause of this logjam. I mean, I don't want to debate what's happened in Congress here, but to talk about it at the public level, I think there is a lot of evidence that the Republican and Democratic parties are farther apart in the general public, that people tend to disagree more on a wider range of issues than they did maybe 10, 15, certainly 20, 25 years ago. Democrats hold a more consistent set of beliefs across a range of issues: government, environment, energy, foreign policy, social issues, and Republicans hold a more consistent set of beliefs on the other side. But nowhere near the level of polarization we're seeing in Washington. At best, it's a sort of modest effect. And the reality is that in the American public, the vast majority are somewhere in the middle. And by middle, I just mean they're not down the line Republican, conservative, or down the line liberal or Democratic. They hold a mix of beliefs and different priorities on issues. And you know, the polarization we think of is probably somehow being magnified as it gets up into Congress. And I think, just to close without getting too far into that, I think it raises a question of why the political center in American politics doesn't create a countervailing force. I mean, if most Americans aren't ideologues on one side or the other, how do we get a Congress that seems to be that? And I mean, part of it is, in reflecting some of what Paul talked about, there are a lot of people in America who don't pay much attention, and they tend to be the people who are less ideological. And they're less likely to vote, and they're less likely to participate. So the voices of those wings tends to be more powerful. But secondarily, while I say there's a political center in America, there's not much of a cohesive, unifying set of values or priorities or principles to that political center. They're as fractured and different in their views and priorities as any other set of people could be. You know, the only thing people in the center tend to agree about is that they're frustrated with what's happening, but they don't have a clear set of priorities, a clear agenda that identifies a new movement in American politics. So one of the favorite questions pollsters like to ask, well, would you like to see a third political party? Again, in principle, a lot of people would say yes, but what that party ought to look like, what its priorities ought to be, what its agenda ought to be is very unclear. There is a center to American politics. The polarization we're seeing in Washington is not just replicated in the American public to any broad extent, but that center hasn't taken hold as a political movement because itself, in and of itself, is pretty politically fractured. So let me finish there.
And so I also mentioned that Pew polling is very influential and drives a lot of news coverage, and Mike is a prominent survey analyst in the media. Our next speaker, Sarah Burd-Sharps, is also an influential media commentator who's talked about a different set of issues through a wide range of media channels. She is co-director of Measure of America at the Social Science Research Council, and she's going to provide what I think is going to be a broader context and a different angle on where Delaware fits into the national political scene.
Thanks. And the clicker is up here?
It's right
okay,
there.
okay. Okay. So yeah, we're leaving, for the political junkies, you're going to have to hang on to the demographic stuff. So we're going to talk a bit about human development. And just to say a word, put a little context on it before I start talking about Delaware, and I hope people can see that. So I run a project called Measure of America. We've been around since 2007, so what are we, 6 years now? And the reason that we exist is because we are, in this country, we like to talk about progress using a lot of economic and financial metrics. And we wanted to really look at sort of reframing the question to talk about people's lives using people metrics instead of economic and financial metrics. And so what we've introduced is what we call sort of a GDP for ordinary people. And our goal really is to generate fact-based public dialogue about issues that people really care about in their everyday lives. And also to put something out there that enables us to hold elected officials and the private sector and others accountable for human progress. We're often knowing what's happening in terms of financial progress, and we don't know well enough about what's happening in terms of human progress. So that's our broad goal. Now, what is this thing called human development that has been mentioned a couple of times? Well, it's defined as a process of improving people's well-being and enlarging their freedoms and their opportunities. And it really puts people at the center of analysis and looks at an interlocking set of factors in the interconnected way that we actually experiencing them, instead of it seeing them sort of in silos. You know, health people deal with health and education people deal with education, yet I'm the same person who feels sick, who goes to school, etc. And those issues are linked together. And human development, our human development, is expanded definitely by the things that we do ourselves and the responsibility that we take for our own lives and decisions and actions, but it also is really influenced by the conditions and the institutions around us in which we grow up and work and grow old. So here's a little bit of a difference. So how is the economy doing is sort of the traditional approach for understanding progress, and what we're trying to say is how are people doing, and that's really the human development approach. And just to say very quickly where it came from, it was developed at the UN. It's rooted in a conceptual framework by a Nobel laureate at Harvard, an economist named Amartya Sen, who developed this thing called the capabilities framework. It was first put out there, published in 1990 in the first Human Development Report at the UN. And what's kind of incredible to see is that in just about every other country in the world except for the US, it's kind of seen as the global gold standard for measuring well-being and access to opportunity. And if you go up to some, man or woman on the street in Brazil, and you ask them what Brazil's Human Development Index, not only can they tell you Brazil's index, but they can also tell you Argentina's, because it's really, the rankings are really a great way for, people looking over their shoulder and, having healthy competition over, people having better lives instead of only, are we growing economically? So that's sort of a very quick lesson on the origins of this concept. And how is it measured? Well, human development is really about everything that anyone in this room and all of us care about. So it includes things like living in a sustainable environment, having equality before the law, religious freedom, all of these things. But the index itself that I'm going to talk a bit more about is really measuring three basic dimensions. And these are kind of basic building blocks of a life of choice and opportunity. And they are about health, about education, and about standard of living. And the index that we've developed is a modified version of the UN's Human Development Index, because the UN's index was created to look at countries everywhere from Rwanda to Norway. And so some of the indicators are not very challenging, for instance, for an affluent democracy like the United States. So for our index, we use the same health measurement, which is life expectancy at birth. For access to knowledge, we look at all kids who are in school from age 3 to 24, and then everyone, the highest degree attained for adults 25 and older. So it's sort of a snapshot of what's happening in education in a place at one time. And then for a decent standard of living, we look at median earnings. So what the typical worker is earning from their wages and salaries. And the long and healthy life indicator we've calculated. Interestingly enough, while we know, every 10 seconds what's happening in the stock market, the United States does not calculate life expectancy at birth for anything beneath the national, 78.9 years of age, and by race and ethnicity. We don't calculate. So we're the only organization who's actually taking the raw death certificates and calculating life expectancy. And that's kind of just one indicator of how little we prioritize something as critical as survival, how long people are living. And what's amazing in this country is that there are places where people are living 25 years longer than other people. And I'll talk a little bit about the disparities in Delaware. They're not that bad. But I mean, across the country as a whole, there's a congressional district in Virginia where people are outliving a congressional district in nearby West Virginia by 13 years. Neighboring states. So these numbers are critical to know, and we're not knowing them. Anyway, in terms of the education and the money part of it, we get those data from the Census Bureau's annual American Community Survey. So it's numbers that are published annually and that are quite reliable. And then we add these three indexes together, we divide by 3, and we get one number. And the one number is between 0 and 10. And what's great about that one number is that it really enables you to compare, racial and ethnic groups and men and women and states with other states, et cetera. So, and that's the index. So what did we find in terms of the human development approach and the index in Delaware? And I'm just going to do a quick little introduction to it, and then you can, if you're interested more, you can look at some of our publications or go to our website. So the historical trend in Delaware is pretty interesting. So in 2000, Delaware's index was 4.96, and remember that's out of 10. And there was definitely steady progress in the decade between 2000 and 2010. And that progress is seen in most every state. But what's really interesting to see, first I was going to talk quickly before I show a little bit more about what the indicators that make it up. I was just going to show how Delaware ranks in comparison to its neighbors. So first, at the top of the scale, you have New Jersey, which is number 3 with a 6.12 Human Development Index. Maryland is 5th of the 50 states in Washington, D.C. Virginia is 11th. Delaware comes in 17th of the 50 states. And Pennsylvania is 20th, and Pennsylvania is at about the US average of 5.07 out of 10, and West Virginia is very near the bottom. So the bottom state is Mississippi, Arkansas, and then West Virginia. And the levels of well-being in West Virginia today are about on par with those of the typical American in 1995. So serious, disparities in West Virginia in terms of these, these basic building blocks. And then I was just going to talk a little bit about sort of this is the trend again in the index, and it also shows the trend since 2000 in the indicators that make up the index. Now, any table like this with so many numbers tells a million stories. I'm just going to sort of show a couple of things that I find pretty interesting. So the first thing is that even though the recession definitely hit median earnings over the, between 2008 and 2010, or 2005 and 2008, health progress carried on. And you see that in most states in the US. And so what's really interesting is that even if the country hits an economic downturn, these investments that we've made in people's capabilities, in their ability to sort of seize opportunities, last longer. And so health made progress even during the recession. However, what's pretty interesting to know is that even though Delaware's overall levels of well-being are higher than the national average, there are two areas where Delaware lags behind the US national average. One is slightly lower life expectancy, not a lot, slightly lower. And the second one is in terms of the proportion of adults, 25 and older, who have a bachelor's degree or more, also slightly below the national average, so pretty interesting. The other story here that's really interesting is you can see that in 2000, median earnings, right, or the wages and salaries of the typical worker were about $34,000 or just under $34,000, went up a little by 2005, and then started going backwards. As a result of the recession. But what's pretty interesting is that every state in the United States, except for 6, saw the same pattern of going backwards. And those 6 states are, interestingly, I think it's Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, New Mexico, states that have fracking in them or that have oil in them. So they were able to weather the impacts of the recession on the basis of natural resource extraction. Was extremely important for them. But none of those states rank very high in terms of human development. So these industries, natural resource extraction, that are really helpful for income and for some salaries, don't have a very good sort of trickle down to well-being in the state as a whole. Anyway, there's more stories in here, but not enough time. And then another thing that we do in every time we look at a place or the nation as a whole is we look at racial and ethnic disparities. We generally look at the 5 major racial and ethnic groups in the United States for which there's reliable data. Because Delaware doesn't have as much diversity in terms of race and ethnicity as most states, we can only get reliable data for African Americans and whites. But even still, just looking at those 2 racial and ethnic groups, it's pretty striking to see. So in terms of life expectancy, there's an African American baby born today in Delaware can expect to live on average more than 3 years less than a white baby born on the same day. So that's a troubling disparity. In terms of earnings, there's also a huge disparity. And in fact, the national disparity between African Americans and whites in terms of earnings is about $7,000. So $9,000 is quite a bit more than that, is a serious and concerning disparity. And it's interesting, down the road to see. So the overall index is 4.10 for African Americans and quite a bit higher for whites. And that's it, pretty much. I just wanted to say that on our website we have a map program where you can map all kinds of data and print things out, and it's fun to play around with. You kind of get sucked into it and start looking at your place and your neighbor's place and your relative's place. So thanks so much.
Yes, and that website is measureofamerica.org. That website is measureofamerica.org, and I can attest that I've played around with it for quite a bit when I should have been doing other things, but it was fascinating, checking out the county where you grew up, the county where you live now. So definitely well worth your time to visit. So we have a bit of time left for question and answer, and following a long-standing national agenda policy, we're going to alternate questions between students and members of the general public. So I do see some students here, so would any student like to lead us off with a question? Yes.
So I know you guys were talking about polarization is much more prevalent in Washington, D.C. as opposed to rural America. And I've heard a lot about like the alternative vote and how our voting system can have a lot to do with that. And I was wondering if you guys could maybe talk about that a little bit and just think if that would work.
So the question is the polarization that we see in Washington, D.C. a reflection, if Mike's saying it's not a reflection of deep polarization in the public, is it a reflection of the rules of the game, the way that we hold elections, would changing the rules make for a less polarized Washington? I have some thoughts about this, but...
I would just say, I think the instinct is right because, but in practical terms, whether it would work, I would maybe see what Paul thought. I mean, I think one of the interesting things to think about with polarization is at the end of the day in the American electoral system, we are only left with two choices. And so if we really dislike one or the other choice, we may look like a really avid fan of one or the other side, but it may have more to do with the fact that we've been presented with two alternatives, neither which are actually that close to us. I think you see, and that's sort of what I was trying to say about a lot of how the issue about the Republican Party right now, which is there may be a lot of Republicans who aren't particularly satisfied with their party, but they dislike the other side so intensely because they see the other side as having moved far to the left that they're going to be very loyal and probably very active, and that's why the Democrats may not be in as strong a position as they would like to be going into this. And it kind of gets to your question, which is our system just gives you those two choices, and if the system is somehow selecting choices that are farther and farther apart, that doesn't satisfy the center anymore and potentially leads to even more turnout disparities moving forward. So people think about reforming the system to see if there's a way to change that dynamic.
Anything to add to that?
Well, I was going to say, one of the things people pay most attention to what the actors are doing. So what you see on television are mostly elected officials. And if you ever take a political science 150 class, we'll always tell you that political parties are not anywhere in the U.S. Constitution. Right? But they create the rules for Congress. They create the rules for how business is done. So when you reform the voting system, that's fine, but once you get into the institution, the broader institution, they will set the rules to maintain whatever system works for them to help get things done. So there are many different layers of the rules that have to be changed. And it's, we like to think of the United States as a democracy. We know it's a republic. We know that, factions are a concern. We know that there are institutional rules in place to keep factions kind of in the ruling public. That's why it's so hard to get a third party around, because the rules are in place to keep things the way they are. And so it's tough to change political culture because people like winning. They like getting the spoils of victory and those kinds of things. So it's a tough thing to do to change.
Question from the general public. Yes.
I have been in this country over 35 years, and portion of my education in this country, and I'm retired today. Number one, I need to mention, and I don't hesitate to hold it inside, that I enjoy the democracy and freedom of speech in this country. Besides all this enjoyment that I do, at least I'm free to speak my heart, what's wrong and what's right. But I come from, I couldn't, so that part of it I'm not going to feel. But during my observation, being involved into politics in the past, and coming from another country, you constantly compare, and you constantly pay attention to every single detail you hear through the media, what you see through the politicians, and you hear and this like that. I even remember things happened 30 years ago between Congress and Senator and all that, because you continue keeping up with all that.
And your question, sir?
My question is, sorry about, I wanted to explain where I come from. My question is, you mentioned that there are two parties that people are fed up in this country, as I have seen, and they are very tired of all the challenges between these two, that people cannot get through their purpose. And you mentioned about the change. How could that change come up when there are corporations and oil companies
million question.
Not that these politicians are making to change the school party, perhaps to better.
All right, so the question, what would it take for a fundamental change in American politics?
A bigger room. We had that answer.
I mean, I think, you know, I think this is, you're hitting at the heart of a question that I think a lot of people are asking, which is this system, are certain voices magnified more than others, in whether it's money or other kinds of influence or just participation, that the reality is that the people who are really, really fired up tend to voice their opinions more strongly. They march on Washington, they vote in primaries and therefore pull those primary elections, as you all have experienced here in Delaware, farther towards extremes and maybe away from the center of that election. I think you can attribute some of it to a sort of corporate influence, but I think some of it also does reflect something that's a kind of a reality of human nature. The people who really are fired up tend to participate more, and whether or not you know, a Christine O'Donnell was backed by a corporation, she had a fired up base that was going to go to the primary and get out there and vote, and then you end up with a candidate who doesn't actually appeal to the center. What's interesting from a party perspective is the parties aren't actually very thrilled with this. I mean, John Boehner didn't like the hand he was dealt, you know, in this primary. He didn't want the troubles that he got from his people. If the parties actually had more control over the primaries, they wouldn't be letting people like Ted Cruz onto the ticket in the first place. You know, they would have controlled access to it, and you probably would actually have more moderate political parties. I mean, you know, one of the ironies from a political science perspective is stronger parties actually, stronger party mechanisms probably actually would lead to more moderate political parties. So it's very hard to kind of think that maybe one way to reduce this is to actually give John Boehner more power over who he gets into his party, to get rid of all of the people on the left and, you know, the extremes on the left and the right. But, you know, empowering the parties is probably a hard sell at a time like this when people are sort of frustrated with the political parties.
And this reminds me of a question that I thought when I was listening to Sarah talk. One of the things that you're talking about, the Human Development Index results, that I think that helps explain why Delawareans are so concerned about the economy and jobs. The question about corporate influence made me think one of the things that you mentioned was the results for how the economy is doing. The states that oil and fracking stood out. And to bring the human development back into politics, I was curious, has there been any kind of political play or kind of political reaction to those results? Or how is that finding that the states that had the oil and the fracking, because I know in neighboring Pennsylvania this is a very controversial issue.
I mean, I think it was really interesting for us when we discovered first that they were the only ones who actually saw income growth, but then when we looked into sort of human development growth and we saw that, you know, that income growth, the fracking and some of these boom towns bring with them a lot of really negative things, increased violence against women, a whole series, you know, sometimes you know, a lot of negative things come along with it, and that the human development levels in some of these states actually did not, you know, benefit from this new, you know, new economic opportunity at a time when there wasn't much in the country as a whole. And I think it's a very contentious issue, right? Of course, fracking is a contentious issue. Natural resource extraction is a contentious issue. And I mean, for anybody who's sort of a student of international you know, the natural resource curse, you know, countries that are really well endowed with extremely valuable minerals often suffer tremendously politically because of the, you know, tendency to grab power and hold on to it because of all the spoils of that natural resource extraction. So it generated a good conversation, I think, about you know, what the broader use to people in the states are of these opportunities, what are, you know, initially seen as opportunities.
A question from another student? Yes.
You talked about, or there's been a lot of talk about having a vision in the parties because the government shutdown, but then you guys also talked about how people are still very much in favor of their original parties. Do you think a third party will emerge, whether that's a legitimate third party or a faction of another party during the midterm election?
All right, interesting question. So prospects for a third party this time around. I have a few thoughts, but.
Would you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question is, with all this frustration with government, is there a window of opportunity for that mythical third party that Mike was mentioning earlier?
Why don't you take this, Paul?
All right, I'll take this one. Well, the political mood that we're in, and feel free to disagree with me, reminds me a lot of what was going on around 1994, even back to 1992, 1996, where there was the last major push for a third party that actually had at least some level of electoral success, which was Ross Perot and then his Reform Party. So Ross Perot got almost 20% of the vote in 1992, and then 8% in 1998. This was an era where, you know, there was that was the last government shutdown. There was a lot of popular frustration. That movement was held together, such as it was, by a charismatic and very well-financed figure, and basically fell apart after he was gone. So it's really kind of an unusual event. And so far, I haven't seen anyone or any set of circumstances that's going to make that happen. And then getting back to these rules of the game that Mike and David were talking about earlier, you know, even Ross Perot wins almost 20%. You know how many electoral votes he won in 1992? 0. And when you win 0 electoral votes in a presidential election, it's really hard to sustain a national political movement.
Yeah.
I have a question related to that, which is how much does gerrymandering of congressional districts push things to the extremes? Because my observation is I speak a lot in places where I feel that, as somebody said, I think it was you who said, that there are many more people in the political center than, you know, one has the impression from reading the newspaper, and that, you know, and that's really the sad thing about all this, is that there are a lot more people who agree than disagree, but that we've got, you know, elected officials who are pretty extreme, and I guess I was always wondering, you know, I mean, the reason that Ted Cruz doesn't worry too much is because he's safe in his district, even if, you know, he's not a particularly popular figure at this moment. Anyway.
No, it's a fascinating issue. I mean, and the fact is Ted Cruz wasn't gerrymandering. The state's always been that way, right? The state lines haven't changed. But no, I think the evidence in political science is pretty mixed about the effect of gerrymandering. In fact, I think a lot of the analysts suggest that it hasn't actually contributed to it much. I think what it does is it does create a lot of people whose electoral focus is on winning their primary rather than winning the general, because they're in either a state or a district where the general balance is so tilted in one direction or the other. But you know, a lot of that is just a geographical issue. You know, that you know, if you're going to draw districts, I mean, I guess Delaware didn't have to draw many districts, right? So,
Just one rep.
One big district.
but you know, you can only do so much to make those districts competitive, and a lot of them end up being lopsided just through geography, and the additional effect of an intentional gerrymandering isn't necessarily that big of a factor on top of it. And in fact, if a state legislature intentionally gerrymandered to try to increase the number of seats their side would win, almost by definition, they're watering down their votes in a way. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but if you want to go from winning 4 Republican seats to 5 Republican seats out of, say, 8 in a state, you actually need to spread out those Republican voters more, which actually ends up creating more competitive districts in a way of picking up seats. So, you know, the whole way that gerrymandering can do this is it's sort of tricky. I was talking just last week with somebody who'd worked in gerrymandering in California, and they said even if you tried to make all the districts competitive in California, you just couldn't do it because Los Angeles and San Francisco have such concentrations of democratically oriented voters, and other parts of California have conservative, that to try to draw a competitive district, you'd have to start at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco and draw this sliver all the way to the Nevada border in order to get enough conservatives and liberals to kind of balance each other out. And people would be outraged if you did that because they want their districts to represent kind of a community. But the reality is if a district represents a community, it's likely to be lopsided in one direction or the other. So it's a really tricky issue.
And it's another reason, of course, why there'll be for a long time only 2 parties, because who gets to write the redistricting rules?
Yeah.
Parties.
And the party that's in power and influence. So their rules are in place, and again, parties are nowhere in anybody's constitution, right? And I think there's only one state where really, like Nebraska, doesn't really do
There's
it.
more of that, like,
Yeah.
you know, courts or nonpartisan commissions, but even there, the
But
evidence
even
is
there,
sort of
who gets
mixed.
on the commission and who's on the court and whether or not they're elected. I mean, this is the tough battle in terms of why getting a third party is so tough. Even if you look at Congress now, Bernie Sanders is the only independent, I think still, Lieberman's not there anymore. Angus King. Oh, he recently came last time.
Maine, yeah, last
Maine.
time around.
So there are two now. We're
Two out of
progress.
100.
Progress. That's a 100% increase. But they have to get seniority to get anywhere in the leadership position on the committee in Congress. So, and if they're not in the party and the party setting the rules for seniority, it makes it much more difficult for them. So, or a new member of Congress to actually do that. So it's tough to start a third party.
Just for my read of the political science research on gerrymandering is pretty much in line with what Mike is saying. I think it's a very popular explanation with pundits, especially Democratic pundits trying to explain why the Democrats don't have a majority in the House. The big evidence against it is that the Senate is as polarized as the House, and by definition, Senate districts aren't gerrymandered. But Mike also touched on the fact that I think is maybe more important to consider, which is primary elections, where, you know, with the shutdown, you're seeing that a lot of Republicans in Congress are acting partly out of pressure or fear of primary challengers. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is facing a primary challenger from the right. You look at the results from our poll, and you know, a lot of people were surprised back in 2010 when O'Donnell beat Mike Castle for the nomination, but a third of the Delaware public has a favorable opinion of O'Donnell and the Tea Party, and they're a big chunk of the primary voters for any Republican primary. So a question from the public down here.
I'm going to remark on two things and ask for you to react to them. The first is, I'm going to go pretty negative, but you know, the first is about fundraising.
I don't know if you want
And
to do
I
Second
think
Life or any of these things.
this is very easy to figure out if you just read a couple fundraising emails from both parties. The more red meat, the more angry you get people, the more they donate. They've studied this, and so that's what they do. They just, you know, the conversation is about firing people up. So then you get people angry, and so that happens. And add to that, it's hard to even watch CNN or MSNBC or any of these other news channels because the conversation is so base and so simple, it's almost moronic. It's almost unbearable. And you watch it, I mean, people watch the Daily Show, and it's become, watching the news has never been more easy to mock. And I think, what can we do? What responsibility do we have as citizens of this country, and does the media have to try to change this landscape? Because it's embarrassing, and we're becoming an international embarrassment.
Any reactions on that? You've done a lot of polling on what the public thinks of the news media.
Yeah. No, your views of the media are well reflected. You're not alone in your criticisms of media and media coverage of politics and of campaigning and the tone of campaigning. I mean, one of the most consistent trends we see in election seasons is how much more just discouraged people feel at the end of the election rather than encouraged. You know, and part of it is the messaging and the tone, and part of it, kind of to David's point, is there are a lot of well-trained political messengers out there. Are you training any of these people, David?
I have no comment. I cannot confirm or deny.
You know, who learn how to use language in ways that will really mobilize people and get people fired up. And I mean, I guess the only optimistic note is that that is not the natural point for most people. You know, most people are, I sort of teased the public, I guess, for saying they want compromise in principle but not in practice, and there's a truth to that. But you know, they do want to see solutions. You know, and I think there is an appetite for that, and whether there's a way for political leadership to kind of grab onto a fundamentally different tone of communication and appeal to people, you know, I think is a very open question right now. I mean, you know, you're seeing a level of public frustration that by many measures, I mean, polling hasn't been around forever, but since the 1950s, you're seeing levels of frustration that have never been seen before. So there's something different here. You know, this isn't just par for the course public frustration. There's something deeper here, and that might open opportunities.
There are two things. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
I was going to say, there are two things. We did a poll in 2010 about compromise. We actually asked this during 2010 midterm year. We asked Delawareans, we said, is compromise 50-50? Both parties have to split 50-50, or is it that both parties should consider the options of the other? And Delawareans overwhelmingly said it's consider the options of the others, not split 50-50. But if you look at the arguments about the government shutdown or about what was going on in 2010, it was about we'll do this if they do that. This kind of zero sum. If you do this, then we'll do that. It was always got to be half. You got to consider what we want, and we'll do what you want. But that's not the way most in the public actually think about compromise. The other thing is, people in the media are pretty smart. They wouldn't put something on television or talk about something that people didn't want to see, right? And so while we tend to dislike things, you know, that thing that, you know, you want to turn away, it's disgusting, you don't want to look at it, but then you just kind of look at it. So while you don't want to look at it, you're still looking at it. And there's a good reason for it. I mean, in the political psychology literature, we're attracted to things that are extreme and different. If it's normal, if it's good, if it's just the status quo, why look at it, right? So if somebody ran across the stage butt naked, we'd say, hey, look, somebody. But if you have clothes on, you're just like, okay. So that's the way in which this works. I mean, the goal is to get your attention, to get you in the store. And once you're in the store, we'll sell you anything we got. Right? So just come in the store. It doesn't matter if the stuff is good product or not, just come in the store. And that's just a model for thinking about it.
The best news stations right now are Al Jazeera America and BBC America.
I'm afraid on that note, we'll have to end with maybe some guarded grounds for optimism and cut things short before we have any streakers here. But I want to thank our speakers, Sarah and Michael and David, and thank all of you for coming out tonight.
Thank you.